So this is my first time back from youth after a super busy sports season, and it's really good to be back. But as many of you know, and probably have heard a lot about if you're in Sunday school, this summer I went on a missions trip to South Africa. And while we were there, it was a really good trip, but it was also super, super exhausting. And so after 7 days of consecutive work, we finally got a rest day. And so we were super excited. We were going to go to the beaches. But when we got there, we weren't allowed to swim at all because they forgot to put up their shark nets. So apparently sharks are a big problem there. But instead we got to play in this enclosed little rock pool. And it was very quiet. Occasionally the waves would lap into it. And while we were there, we got to look at some of the sea creatures inside. And the creatures inside the pool, they were kind of flappy. I couldn't tell whether they were animals or plants. They just didn't have a lot of substance to them. They kind of floated wherever the tide took them. And they were different from the creatures that were visible outside of the rock pool, where the waves were crashing and thrashing, because the creatures that were visibly thriving outside the pool were the barnacles, the creatures that had anchored themselves to the rock. And so a lot of you probably know where I'm going, but I'm comparing this to our faith, is that when we kind of live in the kiddie pool of life, when life is really quiet and easy, it's easy to kind of just live independently, to float along and let life take us where it wants us. But it's outside of the pool, it's outside of our comfort zone, that God really chooses to grow us and to cement us to Him. And so I feel like this has been a theme of my life recently in this past year. As many of you know, my family and I are missionaries to China. And we've been there for 13 years. And so, but recently in April, we had to leave unexpectedly. And that was hard. It was God forcibly putting us out of our comfort zone when we left our home. But, so that's been a theme of my life recently. But actually, I wanted to talk about something even more recent. And that's the process of starting a volleyball girls Bible study with some of my friends. And so this Bible study, it was really scary, and it actually, it just started out as a thought in my brain as I was leaving China and as I was looking towards what life would be like in America. But I didn't do anything about it. I kind of just let it be until South Africa. And after a month of work and kind of exhaustion, they handed us out this paper. On the top, it said mission plan. And so there's kind of this mental groan in the room as we're like, we already did so much, but now you want us to plan out how we're going to continue our mission at home. But I did it. I filled it out with the idea that had come to me in China about doing something with my volleyball team. And then turned it in, and to my horror, they photocopied it, kept the copy, and then handed me the original and said, okay, now we can keep you accountable. So I'm like, oh, great. And ultimately when we do things for God and not for men, or just because men are expecting us to. But it was a really good way to kickstart me to actually try. So that was on my mind when I came back to America and jumped into preseason. And so I decided to play it super safe. I just decided to ask around for interest. So I asked a few people, and I got a few answers maybe, I don't know. And that was fine, but I really wanted encouragement and confirmation, and so I prayed specifically, God, if this is your will, just please encourage me. Please give me one person that says, yes, I will come. And so I think it was in that very week, I was talking with the girls in the locker, and I brought up this subject, and there were 2 girls that were like, yes, that sounds like a great idea. I would do that. And so that was a really cool confirmation and an answer to prayer from God to me. So I decided, then I had to look into more details in the next step. And for those of you who are athletes or just really live life, you know that it's super hard to find a time and a place and just how things will work out. And so I talked with the school principal, I talked with the teacher, I was trying to find if this should be an after-school thing or not. But then I think God really blessed me as I was praying through this when Mr. Stern told me, the owner of, co-owner of Canary Labs, and he said, bring the girls up to Canary Labs on top of Beacon Hill, and we'll find a room for them. And so that was a huge blessing, and the final thing was just really to make the announcement. And that was the scariest part because, one, it was playing to my fear of what will others think of me, and it was playing to my fear of being alone. Like, what if I show up and no one else is there? And so I wrote in my journal that I pulled a Queen Esther, which basically means I waited until the last possible moment to make the announcement. But when it finally was made, during the time in between the announcement and in between the scheduled time to have the Bible study, my prayer was just, God, would you please provide a total of 4, including myself? I feel like that would be at least a good number to start, just to have conversation. And so that was my specific prayer, not knowing who would show up. But when I walked through Central and then walked out of Central later, going towards Beacon Hill, we had a total of 4. And so that was God really specifically showing me that he was there and he was providing. And he was with me through all of this. And so we had a great Bible study, and it's continued to continue for the past month. And we voted to continue it even after volleyball season and open it to other people too. So girls, if you want good study time in the Word, feel free to head up with us. But yeah, and so another specific prayer request that God answered that I wanted to just share is that he answered my prayer request for an Aaron. So Moses, when God called him to do something, he's like, I'm slow of speech. I'm not good, God. I need a person to help me. And so God provided Aaron to really share the same vision and the same calling. And so I didn't know, on my volleyball team where a lot of people weren't Christians, if that would even be possible. But that's what I was praying for from really start till finish, just that I wouldn't be alone in this and that someone would be carrying this with me. And so on that first day of Bible study, it became quite clear that God had provided me an Aaron. I'm not naming names, but it was a really sweet provision from God. And actually I think I have more than one Aaron now. And so that's just something that God has been doing in my life recently and how I've seen him come through. And he's shown me that he's faithful. Even when we step out, when he calls us to do something and we step out, he's faithful to carry us through. But I also want to note that sometimes our version of success is not his version of success. And so I wouldn't really be truthful to tell you the story without telling you about week 2 in my mind. And week 2 is kind of infamous because, that was the day that I had prepared the Bible study talk on glorifying God in humbling circumstances, not just victorious circumstances. And so when I showed up that day, there was one other person there. And so we had a good study, we had great discussion, but as I'm walking out the doors of Canary and people are like, how many kids came that day? And I'm like, well, 1. It kind of did feel a little bit humbling. And I think at that moment, God was like, it hit me like that message was for me. I had prepared it for other people, but God intended it to pierce my heart. And he was calling me to glorify him then. And so I had mixed feelings, the circumstances were not the way I wanted them, but God was using them to work on me. He really cared about me. And so that's kind of the story of what he's been doing recently. But I especially want to go to a passage that we've studied in the past week or 2, which is Philippians 2. And thank you. And 2:13 through 18. And it says, "For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me." And so I think one concept I really want to focus on in this passage, even though there's so much to talk about, is the concept of a drink offering. And so a drink offering, it was a kind of offering that was never really offered alone. It was wine that was to be poured over an existing offering. And the kind of offerings that it was to be offered with were kind of specific. was generally only offered with offerings that were celebratory in nature. So they had more of a joyful nature. They're kind of celebrating a completed work or victory. In addition to that, the Israelites were only allowed to offer their sacrifices with drink offerings once they entered the promised land, so the land of victory. So what I'm getting at here is that drink offerings symbolize joy through completed work. And by comparing himself to drink offering, Paul is saying, one, I see my life as so intermingled with yours, like it's accompanying your lives. It's accompanying your faith. He's poured out his life. He's given his life so that these people could come to know God and then grow in their faith. And then number two, he's saying, it is my joy. It is my joy that I've poured out my life in this way. It is my joy to be able to grow the body in this way. And so seeing others, sharing his faith, and then seeing others grow in their faith were two huge goals of Paul's. I mean, ultimately his goal was to know Christ. But these are goals that are still really up there for him. And so they should be ours as well. So my challenge for you today is really just to ask God, how do you want to pour me out? How do you want to use me to share my faith, to help Christians around me grow in their faith? And maybe some of you are coming here exhausted from life. Maybe you feel like life is already pretty demanding. And that's okay. But I want you to know that if God is calling you to do something, or when he does, if he's not now, that he will be faithful to carry you throughout the process. It's him that put the idea in your brain. It's him that is willing in you. And it's him that's going to be in charge of the works. He's going to be in charge of the process. For it's God who works in you to will and to work for his good pleasure. And so, if there's anything I want you to get from this, it's that one, when you is to one, ask God how he wants to pour you out. And then two is just to know that when you step out, when you feel like a barnacle against the crashing waves, that God, he is there. He's there upholding you, sustaining you. His presence is with you. He will give it his version of success when you're walking in step with him. And he is faithful. And so that's mainly what I wanted to tell you today. But if you don't mind, I'll just pray over us. So, Father, thank you so much that we can come together today. Thank you so much for giving us your word and for giving Paul as an example. I just pray that you would give us the courage to ask you how you want to pour us out, how you want to use our lives, how you want us to share our faith, and how you want to use us in the lives of believers around us. And Father, I pray that our lives would really give you glory, Father, and that as we step out, that we would know you even more, Father, that those wind and the waves, that they would truly be a place of growth and really pressing into you, Father, and seeing you as the sustainer and restorer of our souls. In Jesus' name, amen.